is postmodernism good for the church? And I say, well, it's good and it's bad. Postmodernism is good in just one sense, that it helps to break us out of that modernist box where everything is explained by Marx or Freud or Nietzsche or Darwin or somebody like that. So that's good, but it's also dangerous because they break us out of the box, but then they leave everything open and there's no truth, there's no direction. In fact, they are like the people that Socrates attacked because they said every time you get to a truth, it shoots you somewhere else back and you never get to the truth. And we don't want to get to the truth. We want everything to be a free play.
Well, because they have a fundamental assumption against the opposite of what I would say Socrates and Plato had, that they had a fundamental assumption, that postmodernists, that there is no truth. And so their goal, in a way, is to show that there is no truth, which is horrifying. The most normal people are horrified at the prospect of a world without meaning. Welcome to Socrates in the studio, and welcome to you, my friend, my dear old friend, Dr. Louis Markos. Can I call you Doc since we're friends?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You, in some ways, sum up to me why I do this, because I've always said that the pursuit of truth should be fun. And we always aim for that. And I think because, I and you believe that there is such a thing as truth, it can be fun to look for it. We're not afraid that we're going to find that at the bottom there's no truth and there's no meaning in the universe. And so, but you in some ways typify that. You're kind of like the college professor that I think everybody wishes they had. Certainly that I wish I had. So there's a lot to talk to you about. Today, I want to talk to you about your book. I mean, you've talked about this subject a lot over the years, but finally you wrote a book about it, and it's called From Plato to Christ: How Platonic Thought Shaped the Christian Faith. So the first question may be rather obvious. What led you to put these ideas into a book?
Thanks for having me on, Eric. It's great to be back in New York City. I grew up in New Jersey, so I grew up close going into...
I actually forgot.
Can you imagine? I know. Back in the 70s when New York was just terrible, we would sneak in here, we'd see a show, and we'd go right back home before it got dark. It was wonderful. We had this little ritual. Whenever we went through the tunnel, whenever we got to the New York side, we would start coughing like we couldn't breathe, which is probably what the New Yorkers think about New Jersey. But anyway, now I'm in Houston, Texas.
Right.
But there's kind of two reasons why I wrote the book. The first reason is back in, I think it was 2007, I published a book called From Achilles to Christ: Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics.
From Achilles to Christ. See, this is the problem with you. You've written so many wonderful books. From Achilles to Christ, we will kind of touch on that in another conversation, but you didn't, I'm not giving you a chance to finish, but I don't want to forget to say, we're both Greek.
Yep.
And we're both serious about our faith. And what you do and what our hero C.S. Lewis does is you don't throw away the pagan classical literature. So From Achilles to Christ, I forgot about that book, but that kind of leads us, as you're saying.
Because when I wrote that, I focused on the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and the Greek tragedies. And in my preface back then, I said, I really should talk about Plato, but he deserves his own book. So it took me about 15 years to finally write the Plato book, because I've been thinking about it and simmering about it. But my whole point is what you said. I'm a truth seeker. I believe that there is a real truth. And as a Christian, I believe the ultimate truth is in Christ. But that doesn't mean that everything outside of Christianity is necessarily a lie, right? My motto is that Christianity is not the only truth. It's the only complete truth. So wherever you look, you're going to find bits and pieces of truth, of goodness, of beauty, and they're going to point forward. And much of what I write is called bringing Athens and Jerusalem together. I want to bring together...
Who originally said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Who said that?
It was actually Tertullian. It was an early church father.
Holy cow, wait a minute.
And the funny thing
I thought it was like the 19th century.
I mean, it's kind of been brought back, but he first asked it as a question. And in Greek, of course, every word is Greek. You can ask a question in a way that points to a yes or no. Can't really do that. Well, you can in English. Athens and Jerusalem don't have anything to do with each other, do they? Or
if you put in the heck.
Yeah.
What the heck,
right?
does Athens have to do with Jerusalem?
And when he asked the question, he seemed to think it didn't have much to do with it. But he was a great humanist and classicist himself, Tertullian, pointing all the way forward. So the belief is that, it all rests on a theological distinction between general revelation and special revelation. Special revelation is when God speaks directly. Old Testament, New Testament, the prophets, Christ himself. But, and I don't know if this ever worried you, Eric, but so are you telling me that before Christ came, God just ignored 99% of the world? I mean, only to the Jews did he speak directly.
Well, listen.
But he didn't ignore everybody.
This is another reason I like you, because you are kind of pushing against certain, what shall we call them, evangelical shibboleths. Gesundheit. I think that what you just said will rankle some people. Yeah. There are some people that they see everything as purely issues of salvation.
Right.
They don't see the fullness of truth, and they're made uncomfortable by the suggestion that the Christ whom we worship is present in everything.
Right.
Before he came to earth, we see, in other words, that idea kind of makes some people, they want to act as though, it was all the devil, and then Jesus came, and you were saying, and other great folks.
It's ironic, Eric, because both you and I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church. Sort of God moved us into the evangelical world because we wanted something more evangelical that actually shared the gospel. Right? But a lot of my best students today are now moving the opposite way.
Exactly.
Orthodoxy or Catholicism.
You can get it wrong in both directions.
It's odd because, I think the reason is that they're yearning for a kind of sacredness, ritual, sacrament, all of these things. Baptist school, sometimes you can't tell a Baptist church from a business office or something like that.
Right.
So there's a yearning for the beauty that goes together with goodness and truth. And you and I first met over our mutual criticism of the movie Shrek, because a lot of Christians understand the importance of goodness and truth, but they don't understand the importance of beauty. They might even think beauty's bad because it's anti-egalitarian, right? It makes distinctions between people.
Well, I was going to say that goodness and truth are also anti-egalitarian, but the reason a lot of people, and again, gets into this kind of puritanical, Gnostic, anti-world, right? God created the reality of the world and beauty and all these things, but they really have this Gnostic view. It's like spirit versus the flesh, or right, spirit versus the world. They don't have a fully incarnational view of the world, and so they're always dividing. And so beauty is, that's worldly.
Yeah.
And you think, whoa, no, that's not. It could become worldly. Any good thing could become an idol. But
the real religion of America is twofold. One is utilitarianism. We'll talk about that another day. The other is what we call dualism, the idea that body is bad, soul is good. And there are a lot of Americans that think that body is necessarily bad. No, body and soul are good. Body and soul are fallen. Right? We are incarnational beings, and a lot of times people forget that.
Our friend Nancy Pearcey has written about this in several books, but this is like a fundamental problem in what we can call the evangelical church. It's a fundamental misunderstanding, and again, it's one of the reasons I love you and your stuff is that you are you're trying to build these bridges and say, whoa, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't throw the classics out when Jesus arrives. No. They point to him. It's why we love C.S. Lewis. Well, but yeah.
God has a sense of humor, Eric, and I can prove it, okay? Because when the sort of Christian homeschooling movement started, and that kind of moved into classical Christian schools, I speak for them. Both my kids work for classical schools now. In the beginning, you probably remember, a lot of those homeschoolers were Bible-only people. That's it.
Yeah.
Maybe even King James-only Bible people. Now, today, it is what we call classical Christian, because they are teaching the full pagan classics, Homer, Virgil, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, all of the Herodotus, Thucydides, Sophocles, Euripides, all of these wonderful Greek names. And here's the ironic thing. At the very moment that the so-called Ivy Leagues, Harvard, Yale, are throwing out the classics, what's happening? The least likely people imaginable are going to save the pagan classics. There was a great book came out 10, 15 years ago, How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cale. You probably know that. And he argued that a lot of the pagan classics were saved by these Irish monks in the middle of nowhere. What is going on here? It's really kind of ironic. And here's another irony. The first homeschoolers in America, 50s, were not classical Christians. They were hippies. What do hippies have to do with classical Christians, I mean, with conservative Christians? We don't want our kids raised by the man, okay? We want something that is authentic. And if you really read the classics properly, you're going to see the authenticity. You're going to see the beauty. You're going to see the humanity and the challenge of it. Now, all of this comes back to Plato to Christ because, look, two reasons I wrote the book. One was the follow-up from Achilles. And by the way, From Aristotle to Christ should be coming out in about 2 years from University. So I just signed a contract with them.
I'm inviting you back now.
We'll do that right now.
So from Achilles to Christ.
And then Plato to Christ.
Plato to Christ.
And the next will be Aristotle to Christ.
And then Tinkers to Evers to Chance will be the fourth book.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so from Plato to Christ, there are a lot of people who know that somehow the Gospel of John in the New Testament is somehow Greek Platonic elements there. Should we start there, or should we get there eventually?
Interestingly, it is in John, but the place that I think is the most Greek, oddly enough, is in Hebrews. Now, why is that?
The book of Hebrews.
The book of Hebrews, oddly enough, it says that the temple, the sort of temple in Jerusalem, is only a shadow of the true temple that is in heaven. I mean, that
sounds like Plato's cave.
And I'm not saying that the writer of Hebrews, whether it was Paul, whoever, is necessarily reflecting. See, I am any, old-fashioned, traditional English professor. We love to trace influences, right, from one to the other to the other. But it's important that when I make these connections in a book like From Plato to Christ, I'm not always arguing that there is a direct influence from, say, Plato to this. What I'm saying is that Plato got it right, at least from a Christian point of view. He got something right with his general revelation, from his study of creation, from his study of conscience, reason, imagination, what C.S. Lewis called the good dreams of the pagans, right? That they studied these things and they arrived at something that was true. Now, it's partially true. It's not fully true.
Yeah.
The Bible has that famous phrase in the love chapter, we see now dimly in a mirror, then we will see face to face. Well, sometimes the pagans saw very dimly in a dirty mirror, but they saw something.
Although, couldn't you argue that, how do I put this? This makes me think of my dear departed friend, Thomas Howard.
Oh, he was wonderful.
Whom I've interviewed at Socrates in the City. But in his book, Chance or the Dance, he says, effectively, that everything points to everything. Everything means everything. In other words, any piece of the truth points to all truth. So if a pagan comes up with the truth that 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 = 2, on one level, it's a partial truth. On the other hand, it is truth, which means it partakes of all truth. Like it's inescapable. So anytime a quote-unquote pagan, a pre-Christian, comes up with anything, it's equally valid to...
all truth is God's truth.
To Isaac Newton coming up with the theory of gravity, pointing to God, or truth is truth. And I guess what fascinates me is that you have these people in the 4th century BC in Athens reasoning their way. This is not to deify reason, but reasoning their way toward the God of the Bible. Not maybe getting there, but reasoning their way in that direction. Is that part of what you talk about?
It is, and there's a big misunderstanding, especially in our country. In Calvinism, right, there's the tulip, right? And T stands for total depravity. And when I was growing up, everybody seemed to misunderstand
the acronym.
The acronym.
Not everybody's going to be familiar with this.
The acronym.
We don't always have, necessarily, cognac drinking, bearded, pipe smoking, reformed people watching this. So You're just referring to the acronym in the Reformed tradition, TULIP.
TULIP, right. And
which is appropriate because most of them are Dutch.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. So their concept summed up in the acronym, go ahead.
Right, so total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. We won't go into that. But the first one, total depravity, is often misunderstood. I think especially in America, there's this idea that total depravity means utter depravity, that we are so utterly depraved that my black is God's white, my white is God's black. And that is simply not biblical, right? I mean, we were created in God's image. We still retain the imago Dei, Latin for the image of God.
They can kick that away.
Yeah, sometimes
it makes them uncomfortable. Yeah. It makes them uncomfortable. This is again, that's why I love your stuff, because we have to look at things. We have to hold two things at once.
Right. That's the nature of reality. And I think the higher Greeks and Romans knew this, even though they didn't have the Bible. What does it mean to be man? We are made in God's image, and therefore we have inherent value, worth, and dignity, but we are fallen, right?
Yeah.
And we have to not fall into one of two camps. If we fall into the pure Darwinism, then all there is survival of the fittest, and anything goes. But if we go to the other extreme and we forget about the fallen nature, we become Rousseau, and we try to build utopia. Every time it becomes a dystopia, right? We need the balance between the two. So what total depravity is supposed to mean is that every part of our being has been subjected to the fall. So my body is fallen, my soul is fallen, reason, and there's no part of me that's absolutely pure. So, that's why we need a touchstone of truth. But not utterly.
But the other side of it is that every cell in our bodies, while partaking of the fall, is also reflecting the image of God.
Yeah.
So it's inescapable. It's both. And so, there's some people that they're uncomfortable with beauty because they say that's worldly. They want to have this binary view, dualism. Okay, so from Plato to Christ, to get back to your book, how does Plato, this classical Greek, how does he begin pointing toward what we now know to be Christian faith and Christian theology? How does he do that? Where does he start?
And nobody can say 100%, but I make my argument. What's the relationship between Socrates and Plato, right? Socrates never wrote anything down, but in most of Plato's dialogues, Socrates is the speaker, right? There's a few later dialogues where we don't see Socrates, but most of the great ones, Socrates is speaking, but it is Plato's ideas. What's the difference between the two? My argument would be that Socrates is the man that comes in and wipes the board clean so that Plato can then come in and write the truth on it. Let me explain. Most of Socrates, what he's doing is trying to arrive at definition. So we're having a dialogue, and I ask you, what is truth? And you suggest a definition for it. And I use, that famous Socratic dialogue, question and answer, to show you that you're wrong and you've actually contradicted yourself. And it's a lot of fun. It also gets rich people really angry. That's why they killed Socrates, because he made them all look like idiots. But he wasn't doing it as an end in itself. He wasn't a deconstructionist. He was deconstructing in the sense that he wanted to break down the phony truth, truth with a little t. He wanted to wipe it clean, but not as an end in itself, but as a preparation for now seeking the real truth.
Okay, it's really the opposite of deconstruction.
It really is.
In other words, one of them is a nihilistic project.
Yeah.
And the other one is the opposite. I don't know what the word would be for an opposite of a nihilistic project. But the point is, Socrates, and of course Plato, had this core belief, and you wonder where they get this from, except that God put it there, that there is such a thing as truth, that it is knowable, that it is worth arguing toward, reasoning toward, that process is likely fruitful and worth pursuing. So it's interesting that they had that view, so that even Socrates, who's trying to tear down false arguments, there's no question that it's only as you've already said, to prepare the way for finding truth.
It's not an end in itself.
Yeah.
It's a preparation.
Right.
So once we know what is false or what is not universal, then we can. And my argument would be that Socrates is mostly a negative kind of philosophy, but it prepares the way for Plato to then answer the questions. Because if you read the early Socratic, if you read the early Platonic dialogues, which to me seem more purely Socrates, they almost always end with an impasse. The Greek word is aporia or aporia, waylessness. Like you get to an end and we don't know and we just end. And it gets you very frustrated. And in fact, if all we had were those early dialogues, I don't think we would consider Plato to be the great philosopher. But then we move into the middle dialogue. The great middle dialogues are things like the Republic, the Gorgias, the Phaedrus, the Phaedo, all of the Timaeus, the Symposium. In the middle dialogues, we move past the impasse into truth. Now we want to get to that which is good, true, and beautiful, what is universal, absolute truth. And many people today are very uncomfortable with anything that's absolute truth, right?
So to reiterate your characterization of Socrates as principally negative, in other words, tearing down, would you say that when he says that, did they say it of him or did he say it of himself? But, he's the wisest man because he knows that he knows nothing.
Yes.
In other words, that's the preparation,
Right.
is to know that you know nothing. And if you know that, now you can maybe move toward knowing something.
If you want to start your reading of Plato, the best place to start is with the Apology. And this is 399 BC, and Socrates, who's about 70 years old, is put on trial. They don't like his teaching. They accuse him of impiety, right? They accuse him of corrupting the youth. They basically accuse him of everything they're guilty of. We won't go into the people that do that today, right? But they actually accuse him of what they are guilty of. And they bring him before the trial and say, defend yourself. And Socrates says, let me explain to you why it is every day I go to the agora, the marketplace. I go there, set up my table, and I question people. Because many years earlier, when he was younger, someone asked the Oracle of Delphi, who is the wisest of men?
Okay, now thank you.
Remembering that? Right.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This is why you're here.
Yeah, this is Socrates in the city. This is why we're here, right? So Socrates said, no, I'm not the wisest man in the world, and I'm going to prove that I'm not the wisest man in the world by finding someone who is wiser. And so I don't know why, Eric, but the first people he goes to that he thinks are wise are the politicians, the statesmen. Surely they know. They are running our great democracy. Surely they know. And so he would go and ask them simple questions like, well, you're running a country. What does justice mean, right? What does it mean? What does democracy mean? And he discovered that none of them had any idea. They thought they knew, but they didn't know anything. And you said it a moment ago, Socrates realized that he was wiser in the sense that at least he knew that he didn't know, right? That famous Socratic humility, if you want to call it that. Right? He knew that he didn't know. And so he did, but see, the trouble is that every time you do that, all the young people gather around and laugh at the big puffed up politician, and that makes you enemies. Then he said, all right, I'm going to go find, and I'm going to go talk to the poets because they say these wonderful, beautiful things. They must have wisdom. And he discovered that the poets actually don't know anything. And he says that anybody in the crowd could have interpreted the poem better than the poet. And so poets basically act by inspiration, the sort of divine madness, but they don't know what they're doing, right? Then last, he goes to the craftsmen, the people that have a technique. They go to the craftsmen, and he finds out there that they're very good at woodworking or whatever, but because they're good at that, they think they're good at everything else. And probably half of your people listening are doctors, but I like to make fun of doctors because most doctors are brilliant, and they therefore think they know everything else, and usually they actually don't know anything else. And it was so funny that he broke. Well,
this is the human condition. Let's be honest, right? It's like Freud, writing Moses and monotheism, proving himself to be an idiot. Because once you leave your field, it's embarrassing. So that's a classic case of you where you should stay in your lane. But okay, so what you're saying, this is I'm forgive me for being openly fascinated, but that's why I love you, Lou, because you really do help us to understand how it all happened. And so here you have as you're talking about Socrates, simply, and it's just, look, you have to be a genius to do it. He was a genius. But to question people in just the right way to reveal what they know and what they don't know, and it's horrifying for those people. But of course, and I don't mean to leap from Plato to Christ so quickly, but it reminds me of Jesus talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It must have been horrifying for them to have this genius questioning them with precisely the questions that would reveal their ignorance and foolishness, and in some ways their evil intentions.
Right. And it's interesting you bring that up, because the difference is Jesus is giving us that paradox, let's say, to open up the truth. But when the Pharisees do it, tell me, Jesus, we know you are a good man who speaks the truth.
Yeah.
Shall we pay taxes to Caesar?
Yeah.
They're not seeking truth. They're seeking to trip him up and make him sort of damn himself, whatever he does. There's a big difference between that. Whenever I speak for evangelicals, especially 10 years ago, they always ask me, is postmodernism good for the church? And I say, well, it's good and it's bad. Postmodernism is good in just one sense, that it helps to break us out of that modernist box where everything is explained by Marx or Freud or Nietzsche or Darwin or somebody like that. So that's good, but it's also dangerous because they break us out of the box, but then they leave everything open and there's no truth, there's no direction. In fact, they are like the people that Socrates attacked, because they said every time you get to a truth, it shoots you somewhere else back, and you never get to the truth. And we don't want to get to the truth. We want everything to be a free play.
Well, because they have a fundamental assumption, against the opposite of what I would say Socrates and Plato had, that they had a fundamental assumption, that postmodernists, that there is no truth. And so their goal, in a way, is to show that there is no truth, which is horrifying. The most normal people are horrified at the prospect of a world without meaning. We were talking earlier off camera about Ingmar Bergman and Woody Allen. They have the wisdom, Bergman and Allen, to see a world without God as a nightmare. But they just think it's true and they have to deal with it. But they have the wisdom to see that it's not a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, Woody Allen has his epiphany moment watching the Marx Brothers. I mean, if you got no God, that's the best you're going to go, is Groucho. I mean, that's great stuff. But you're right. When we read, and that's why the great Francis Schaeffer would always use films, films like Bergman and whatnot, to point out. He called it tearing the roof off somebody. What he meant by that is you've got to show them, kind of Socratically, where are your theories leading? If you take your worldview of sort of nihilism, what it leads to is meaninglessness, right? And so you're taking off the roof, and what does
meaninglessness lead to? The death camps.
Yeah.
Satanic nihilism, the absence of any law, morality, goodness. I mean, in other words, people need to be shown that. Yeah. But so to go back to the book From Plato to Christ, I don't want to lose that thread. So how does Plato point to Christ?